My Aunt Sarah's last breath wasn't a goodbye. It was a confession. I was holding her hand when it happened, that hand, thin as paper, cold at the knuckles but warm in the center, the way dying hands always seem to keep one small coal of life burning longest where you touch them. The hospice room smelled like lavender oil and clean linen, the kind of smell they use to cover up the other smell, the one nobody says out loud. My mother was on the other side of the bed. My stepfather, Richard, stood by the window with his arms crossed, the way he always stood when he wanted to look present without being involved. Aunt Sarah had asked for a prayer. That wasn't unusual. She'd been asking for prayers all week, small ones, the kind that sound like she was rehearsing something. But this one was different. Her voice, which had been a whisper for 3 days, came out clear. Clear like a bell you didn't know was still in the house. Forgive me, Lord, for the lie I carried for Margaret, for the name I never let her daughter hear. Elijah Cole was her father, not Warren, never Warren. The machines kept beeping. Nobody moved. My mother's face went the color of the wall behind her. I sat there in my folding chair with my aunt's hand still warm in mine, and I understood, in the space of one sentence, that every photograph on my mother's mantel, every story about my father dying in a car accident before I was born, every anniversary of a man named Warren Ellery that we visited at a cemetery plot twice a year, all of it had been built on top of a name my dying aunt had just said out loud like a confession she couldn't carry into whatever came next. A room meant for goodbye had become a courtroom, and I was about to find out that the inheritance my mother had spent 30 years protecting wasn't money. It was me. My name is Naomi Ellery. At least, that's the name that's been on my driver's license, my college diploma, my wedding invitations, the name stitched into every official document of my 34 years on this earth. Ellery, after Warren Ellery, the man my mother told me was my father, who died in a highway accident outside Baton Rouge 4 months before I was born. I grew up with his photograph on the mantel, a young man in a denim jacket, squinting into the sun, one hand shading his eyes. My mother kept exactly one photo of him displayed, and the rest, she said, in a box I'm not ready to open. I never once saw the inside of that box. I never once thought to ask why a woman who claimed to have loved someone enough to name a daughter after his memory couldn't stand to look at more than a single photograph of him. Children don't interrogate the architecture of their own lives. They live inside it. The walls are the walls. You don't ask who built them or why the foundation feels, on quiet nights, slightly uneven. My mother, Margaret, is a careful woman, precise. She irons pillowcases. She keeps receipts in a labeled accordion folder going back a decade. She is the kind of woman other women describe as put together, which is a compliment that, I've since learned, often means someone has worked very hard to make sure you never see the seams. Aunt Sarah was my mother's older sister, and she was the opposite kind of careful, careless in the warm way, the way that let a kid track mud through her kitchen without flinching, the way that let you cry into her shoulder without asking what was wrong first. Sarah never married. She lived 4 blocks from us my whole childhood, and some of my clearest memories are not of my mother's house, but of Sarah's, the smell of her coffee, the sound of her ancient window unit, the way she'd let me stay up late on Fridays to watch old movies and never once told my mother. I loved my mother. I want to say that clearly before anything else because everything I'm about to tell you could make it sound like I didn't. I did. I do. But love and honesty are not the same current, and for 34 years, my mother chose one over the other, and I never knew there was a choice being made at all. Growing up, there were things I noticed and set aside, the way you set aside a stone in your shoe that isn't quite bad enough to stop walking for. My mother flinched just slightly whenever anyone asked about my father's family. Was there a grandmother? Cousins? And always answered with some version of his side wasn't really in the picture. I never met a single Ellery relative. Not at a wedding, not at a funeral, not in a Christmas card. For a man supposedly beloved enough to be memorialized with a cemetery visit every spring and every October, he seemed to have arrived in my mother's life with no family at all, like weather. There was also this. I don't look like the photograph on the mantel. I have my mother's small ears and stubborn chin, sure, but my eyes, a deep brown that goes almost black in low light, and the particular slope of my nose, and a laugh that, according to my grandmother when she was still alive, came from nowhere in this family, I swear. I used to think that was just what grandmothers said. Old-fashioned commentary on genetics, the kind that means nothing. I understand now, she may have meant it literally. Aunt Sarah used to look at me sometimes in a way I couldn't place. Not suspicion, something closer to grief wearing a smile. When I was 16 and got my first real heartbreak, sobbing on her back porch about a boy named Danny, she held my face in both her hands and said, "You have his eyes, you know. Whoever you end up loving in this life, they're going to fall into those eyes and not know how they got there." At the time I assumed she meant Warren's eyes. I filed it away the way I filed away everything else that didn't quite fit. A stone in the shoe, not worth stopping for. My mother married Richard when I was 7. He was a steady, unremarkable man, an accountant, methodical, the kind of person who alphabetizes his spice rack. He never tried to be my father in any performative way, never demanded I call him Dad, never inserted himself into the mythology of Warren Ellery. In some ways, I respected that. In hindsight, I wonder if it was less respect and more disinterest. Richard treated the entire subject of my biological parentage the way he treated a closed file cabinet. Not his business, not worth the paperwork. We were not, by any means, a wealthy family. Comfortable, careful, the kind of household where vacations were planned 18 months in advance and the good china came out twice a year. So when Aunt Sarah's health began to decline last spring, ovarian cancer, caught later than anyone would have liked, the conversations that started happening in hushed tones around our kitchen table weren't really about money, or so I believed. I was wrong about that too. Sarah's diagnosis came in March. By June, she'd moved from her house into a small assisted hospice apartment closer to the hospital, and I started visiting twice a week, then 3 times, then in the final month, almost daily. I told myself it was because she'd never had children of her own, and I didn't want her to be alone. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth because somewhere underneath the grief, some part of me had started noticing things I couldn't yet name. She talked more than usual in those final weeks. The pain medication loosened things in her the way pain medication does, dissolving the careful walls people build around old secrets. Most of it was harmless, stories about their childhood, about my mother stealing her lipstick in high school, about a boy named Peter Ashcombe who broke Sarah's heart in 1979, and who she swore, even at 61 and dying, she'd never fully forgiven. But some of it wasn't harmless, some of it snagged. One Tuesday in July, she was drifting in and out, more asleep than awake, and she said without opening her eyes, "Does Elijah know how tall you got?" I laughed it off. Who's Elijah, Aunt Sarah? Her eyes opened, just for a second, and something passed over her face. Panic, maybe, or the specific horror of a sleepwalker realizing they've been talking in a room full of people. "Nobody, baby, old friend. Ignore me. The medicine makes me say all kinds of nonsense." I did ignore it, or I tried to. But 3 days later, going through a box of old photographs Sarah wanted sorted before her words, made things easier on everybody. I found a photograph tucked into an envelope behind a stack of 1980s Polaroids. It wasn't labeled. It showed a young man, maybe mid-20s, sitting on the hood of a car, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. He had deep brown eyes that went almost black. I didn't think much of it in the moment. A friend of Sarah's from her 20s, probably one of the dozens of names she'd dropped that summer that I'd never be able to place. I slipped the photo back into the envelope, back into the box, and didn't think about it again until the day of the final prayer, when a name I'd never heard falling from my mother's mouth in 34 years fell instead from Sarah's, clean and certain, on her way out of this world. Elijah Cole was her father, not Warren, never Warren. Here is what nobody tells you about the moment your entire history rearranges itself in front of you. Your body keeps functioning before your mind catches up. I remember setting Sarah's hand down gently on the blanket. I remember standing. I remember the machines still beeping, oblivious, mechanical, uninterested in the fact that a woman's soul had just left the room carrying 30 years of somebody else's silence with it. My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not a sob, something smaller and more animal, like air being forced out of a space too narrow for it. "Sarah," she started. The nurse, a heavy-set woman named Denise who had been kind to us all week, stepped forward gently to check Sarah's vitals, to do the quiet professional work of confirming what we already knew. She said something soft about "she's gone, I'm so sorry," and reached to note the time. Nobody in that room was listening to her. We were all still standing in the wreckage of the sentence before. Richard had gone very still by the window. I watched him look at my mother the way you look at someone you suddenly realize you might not fully know, and I understood in that look that this was news to him too. Whatever my mother had built, she had built it alone, brick by brick, for over 3 decades, and even the man who shared her bed had never been handed the blueprint. "Mom," my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Who is Elijah Cole?" She didn't answer right away. She was staring at Sarah's face, at the stillness of it, and I think some part of her was furious. Not at me, not even really at Sarah, but at death itself for taking away her last chance to control the narrative, for letting the truth slip out on a schedule she hadn't authorized. "Not here," she finally said. "Not like this." "She just said my father's name with her dying breath, Mom. There is no better time than this." Denise, sensing the particular gravity of what was happening, quietly asked if we needed a few minutes alone with Sarah before the next steps, and stepped out, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. The hallway noise, a cartwheel, a distant television, the ordinary hum of a hospital continuing to exist around us, filtered in through the gap. My mother sat down heavily in the chair Sarah's hospice worker usually used. She put her face in her hands for a long moment, and when she looked up, she looked older than I had ever seen her. "His name was Elijah," she said. "Elijah Cole. We were together for almost 2 years before your father, before Warren. I got pregnant with you at the very end of it, right when things were falling apart between us, and by the time I knew for sure, Elijah and I hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. I met Warren 4 months later. I told myself, told everyone that the math worked out. Nobody questioned it. Nobody had a reason to." "Nobody except you," I said. "You knew." "I suspected," she said, which was, I would learn later, a very careful word for a woman who had spent 3 decades curating a very careful lie. Richard finally spoke, quietly, from the window. "Margaret, is this why the Ellerys never came around? Why there was never a single relative from his side at our wedding, at anything?" My mother's silence answered him more completely than any sentence could have. "I want to tell you I screamed, or that I stormed out, or that I said something devastating and final in that room. I didn't. I sat back down in my folding chair, next to my aunt's body, which the machines had finally gone quiet around, and I asked the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Is Elijah Cole still alive? My mother closed her eyes. I don't know, she said. I haven't spoken to him since before you were born. Grief has a strange way of running on 2 tracks at once. I buried my aunt 12 days later. In a service, she'd planned herself down to the hymn numbers, and I cried the way you cry for someone who loved you plainly and without conditions your whole life. But underneath that grief, a second, colder current had started moving, methodical, almost clinical, the part of me that needed facts more than I needed comfort. I am, by profession, a paralegal. I have spent 9 years reading documents for the small gaps where the truth hides between the lines everyone assumes are boring. It is not a skill I expected to turn on my own family, but grief makes strange use of whatever tools you happen to have in your hands. The day after the funeral, I went back to Sarah's apartment. The lease was still active for another 2 weeks, and my mother, uncharacteristically, hadn't argued when I said I wanted to help finish sorting Sarah's things. I think some part of her understood that stopping me now would only confirm there was more to find, and some part of her, exhausted from 30 years of carrying it alone, might have actually wanted me to find it. I found the envelope with the unlabeled photograph again, this time reading the back for the first time, where a faded pencil note said only, "E's 4th of July, 89. I found something else, too, tucked inside a hat box on the top shelf of Sarah's closet, wrapped in a scarf the way you wrap something you intend to protect rather than something you intend to forget. A small stack of letters, postmarked over a span of 18 months, addressed to Sarah, not to my mother. The return address in a neat, slanted hand read, E. Cole. I sat on the floor of my dead aunt's closet with those letters in my lap for a long time before I opened the first one. Whatever was inside them, I understood, wasn't just going to answer the question of who my father was. It was going to answer the much larger, much more dangerous question of what my mother, and possibly Sarah too, had spent 34 years protecting me from knowing, and what, exactly, it was going to cost all of us now that the protecting was over. I opened the first letter. There were 9 letters in total, spanning from the autumn after I was born to the spring I turned 2. I read them in order, sitting on the closet floor with my knees pulled up, the hospital-cornered light of Sarah's apartment turning gold and then gray around me as the afternoon wore on. The first letter was gentle, almost shy. Elijah wrote that he'd heard through a mutual friend that Margaret had had a baby girl. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He asked Sarah, as someone he still trusted even after everything, whether it was true what people were saying that the timing worked out a little too neatly for Warren. He asked if there was a chance the child was his. He said he wasn't writing to cause trouble. He said he only wanted to know. The second letter, 3 months later, was different. Sarah must have written back. None of her replies were in the hat box, only his, and whatever she'd told him had clearly not satisfied him because this one was more direct. He said he'd done the math himself more than once, and it didn't work the way Margaret wanted people to believe it worked. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking to disrupt anyone's marriage. He said, and I remember the exact words because I read them 4 times before I could make myself keep going. He only wanted her to know one day that somebody out here had loved her before she was even born, if she was his. That was all he was asking Margaret for, one conversation. He never got it. By the 4th letter, his tone had changed again, not angry, but tired, in the particular way of someone who has asked for something reasonable enough times that the asking itself has started to cost him something. He mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother, my grandmother, a woman I would never meet, had passed away, and that she'd asked about Margaret's baby more than once before she died, wanting to know if there was a grandchild out there she'd never gotten to hold. He said his family had land outside of Opelousas, not much, but it was theirs, going back 3 generations, and that if the child was his, she had people, roots, a whole side of a family tree nobody had ever told her existed. The letters went quiet after that for almost a year. Then, in what turned out to be the final one, dated 2 months before my 2nd birthday, his handwriting looked different, smaller, more controlled, like someone forcing calm onto a page. He thanked Sarah for her honesty, whatever that honesty had been. He said he understood, finally, that Margaret had made her decision, and that continuing to write was only going to make things harder for everyone, including a little girl who deserved a mother who wasn't afraid. And he understood now that being afraid was exactly what he represented to her. He said he wouldn't write again. He asked Sarah to do one thing for him, to tell the child someday, if it ever felt right, that he'd wanted her. That was all. Not that he'd fought for her, not that he'd won anything, just that he'd wanted her, and that the wanting hadn't gone anywhere even after the letters stopped. I sat in that closet and understood that my Aunt Sarah had carried this exact promise for 32 years, and had finally, at the very edge of her own life, found a way to keep it. Not through a calm conversation the way Elijah had once hoped for, but through a single sentence, gasped out during a prayer, because it was the only door still open to her. I called my mother that night. I didn't yell. I asked her one question. Did you know he had land, a family? Did you know any of this, or did you just decide it didn't matter? The silence on the other end of the line told me everything her voice, when it finally came, only confirmed. I knew enough, she said. I knew enough to be scared, and I made a choice, and I have had to live with that choice every single day since, Naomi. Don't you dare think I haven't. I want to be honest about something. I went looking for Elijah Cole expecting to find either nothing, a man who'd moved on, remarried, built a life that had no room in it for a daughter who was a stranger to him, or, at best, an awkward, complicated reunion that would take years to feel like anything real. I did not expect to find a law office in Lafayette, Louisiana. It took me 11 days of careful searching, public records, an old property tax database, a call to a county clerk's office that a colleague at my firm helped me place under the guise of routine title research. Before I found the name Cole attached to a parcel of land outside Opelousas, and from there, an obituary. Elijah Marcus Cole. Died 2 years and 4 months before Sarah's final prayer. Survived by no spouse, no listed children. Predeceased by his mother and father. The obituary was short, respectful, the kind written by someone with more grief than words. Underneath it, almost as an afterthought, was a single line. Services handled by a small firm in Lafayette. I called the number listed on the firm's website the following Monday, on my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking garage of my own office, because I didn't trust myself to make this call anywhere someone might see my face while I made it. I explained who I was, carefully, without leading with anything I couldn't yet prove. I asked if the firm had handled the estate of an Elijah Cole. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me before the woman said another word that I had just walked into something larger than I understood. "Ms. Ellery," she said, and something in the careful way she said my last name told me she already knew exactly who I was, or who I might be. "I need to transfer you to one of our partners. We've actually been trying, on and off, for almost 2 years, to locate a Naomi Ellery in connection with Mr. Cole's estate. We'd almost given up." Her name was Denise Fontenot. No relation, she clarified with a small, surprised laugh, to the hospice nurse who'd shared her name. A coincidence I chose to take as a small kindness from the universe rather than examine too closely. She explained, gently but plainly, that Elijah Cole had executed a will 4 years before his death. A will that named any biological child of my mother, under her maiden name, as a contingent beneficiary, entitled to a portion of his estate should paternity ever be legally established. He had left instructions with the firm to attempt to locate that child using whatever legal means were available, funded from the estate itself, for a period of up to 5 years following his death. 2 private investigators had come up empty across 2 years of searching, in part, Denise Fontenot told me carefully, because the child in question had been raised, from birth, under a different surname entirely, with no public record anywhere connecting her to the name Cole. "He wanted you found," she said. "He was very specific about that in his instructions. His file notes say, almost word for word, that he didn't need you to want anything back. He just didn't want you growing up thinking nobody had ever chosen you." I sat in that parking garage for a long time after we hung up, the phone warm in my hand, staring at the concrete pillar in front of my windshield, thinking about a man I had never met who had spent the final years of his life making sure a lawyer in a city I'd never visited would keep looking for a daughter he'd never held, because he refused to let her grow up believing what my mother's silence had, functionally, taught her to believe. That she was an inconvenience, someone had needed to be managed around. The estate wasn't enormous. A modest house on the family land outside Opelousas, some savings, a small life insurance policy Elijah had kept current for over 2 decades, nomming any child of my mother's, to be identified through DNA testing upon claim. It wasn't the kind of inheritance that changes a life financially, but it was never really about the money, and I understood that the moment Denise Fontenot read me that line from his file notes. It was about a man who had spent 34 years leaving a door unlocked, on the chance that someday, someone would finally walk through it. My mother wanted to meet at the house. I insisted on neutral ground, a diner halfway between our 2 lives, fluorescent lit, the kind of place where nobody raises their voice because the vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee make grand emotion feel faintly ridiculous. Richard came too, though he sat slightly apart, a man still working out where he belonged in a story that had rewritten itself without his knowledge. I laid it all out plainly, the letters, the obituary, the estate, Denise Fontenot's careful, professional voice reading me a dead man's final wishes. I watched my mother's face while I spoke, and for the first time in my life, I watched her stop performing composure entirely, watched 34 years of careful architecture come down not with a crash, but with something quieter and in its own way more devastating: exhaustion. "I was 23, she said finally. I was scared, and my mother, your grandmother, told me in no uncertain terms that if I raised that child as a single mother in that town, in that decade, I would lose every door that had ever been open to me. Warren came along, and he was kind, and he was willing, and I let myself believe that being willing was the same as being right. I told myself I was protecting you. Some part of me even believed it. You didn't protect me, I said. You protected yourself. You let me grow up thinking I came from a man in a photograph who died before I could ever ask him a single question. You took away every choice I could have made about my own life, whether to know him, whether to know his family, whether to decide for myself if any of it mattered to me. You didn't protect me from anything, Mom. You protected your own comfort, and you let Sarah carry the guilt of it for 30 years because she loved you too much to expose you. My mother didn't argue with that. She sat with it, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched, and after a long silence she said the only thing, I think, that she had left to say. You're right, and I don't know how to undo 34 years, Naomi. I only know how to be honest about it now, which is 34 years too late, and I understand if that's not enough. It wasn't a courtroom scene. Nobody produced a forged document. Nobody was arrested. There was no dramatic unmasking of a villain, because the truth, in the end, was smaller and sadder than that. A frightened young woman had made a choice 34 years ago, and had spent every year since building a life sturdy enough that the choice would never have to be examined. The wreckage wasn't caused by malice. It was caused by fear, compounded, year after year, by silence, until the silence became its own kind of lie, indistinguishable from the original one. I did not forgive her that day. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story about instant redemption. I told her I needed time and space, and that I was going to go to Louisiana, to see the land, to meet whatever family Ellery-Cole had left behind who might still be willing to meet me. She didn't try to stop me. I think, in some tired, relieved way, she was grateful someone else was finally going to carry a part of this that she'd carried alone for far too long. I drove down alone, 6 months after Sarah's funeral. On a Saturday in late October when the light in Louisiana turns the color of steeped tea in the late afternoon. The land was smaller than I'd pictured, 9 acres, a modest house with a wraparound porch that needed paint, a pecan tree in the side yard that Elijah's cousin, a woman named Denise, told me he'd planted himself the year his mother died. Denise Cole-Broussard was 60, warm, sharp-eyed in a way that reminded me painfully of Aunt Sarah. She'd been executor of the small estate alongside the law firm, and she'd spent 2 years wondering. She told me over sweet tea on that same wraparound porch whether the search for my mother's daughter would ever turn up anything at all. He talked about you, she said. Not often because it hurt him too much to talk about it often. But every few years, usually around your birthday, he'd get quiet for a few days, and I knew where his mind was. He kept a photograph of your mother from back then, tucked in his wallet, for longer than I think even he wanted to admit to himself. Not out of anger, just wondering. He wanted to know if you had his eyes. I did. Denise Cole-Broussard looked at me on that porch and started to cry before I'd even confirmed anything with the DNA test that would, 3 weeks later, formally establish what both of us already knew standing there in the October light. I spent that weekend walking the 9 acres, sitting under the pecan tree Elijah had planted the year his mother died, meeting cousins and second cousins whose names I would spend the next year learning properly, whose faces, again and again, showed me the shape of my own in ways 34 years with the Ellery family portrait had never once managed. It has been a little over 2 years now since Aunt Sarah's final prayer rearranged my life in the space of a single sentence. I kept the house outside Opelousas. I couldn't bring myself to sell land 3 generations of a family had held onto, land my father had planted a tree on the year he lost his own mother. I visit twice a year now, spring and fall, the same rhythm my mother once used to visit a cemetery plot belonging to a man who, it turned out, had never really been the center of the story at all. My relationship with my mother is not fully repaired, and I've stopped believing it ever will be in the simple, tidy way people want these stories to end. We speak. We have dinner every few weeks. She has met Denise Cole-Broussard exactly once, at my insistence, in a meeting that was stiff and careful and, I think, necessary for both of them, Two women who had each, in their own very different ways, spent decades carrying pieces of the same secret. My mother apologized to her directly, for the first time, for 34 years of silence that had cost Elijah's family the chance to know me while he was still alive to see it. I legally added Cole to my name last spring, not replacing Ellery, which is still, in its own complicated way, part of who I am, but standing alongside it. Naomi Ellery-Cole. My license, my mail, my email signature, all of it now carries both halves of a history nobody let me choose for myself until I finally chose it myself. Richard, of all people, has become one of the steadiest presences through this. He never pretended the discovery didn't complicate things, but he never once made it about himself either. "You had every right to know where you came from," he told me once, simply, over a Sunday dinner. "That right doesn't expire just because it's inconvenient for the adults around you." I think about Aunt Sarah often more, if I'm honest, than I think about either of my father's most days. I think about the particular kind of love it must have taken to carry someone else's secret for 3 decades out of loyalty, and the particular kind of courage it must have taken to break that loyalty, finally, in the last minutes of her life, because keeping the promise mattered more to her than keeping the peace. I visit her grave more than I ever visited Warren's, which feels like its own kind of quiet justice, though I try not to think of it in those terms too often. Revenge was never really what this story was about, whatever the family gossip in the years since might suggest. It was about a debt finally being paid, not in money, not in blame, but in truth, delivered decades late, by a dying woman who understood, in the end, that some silences cost more to keep than they ever saved. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry at my mother, at the years lost, at a childhood built on a foundation that turned out to be uneven in exactly the way I'd always half-sensed, but never let myself examine. I understand why they ask. It would be the simpler story, the more satisfying one for an audience that wants a villain and a triumphant unmasking. But the truth is quieter than anger and harder to sit with. My mother was 23 and frightened in a world that would have punished her choice far more harshly than it ever punished her silence. That doesn't make the silence right. It makes it human, which is a much more complicated thing to forgive, because there's no clean villain to walk away from, just a woman who made a fearful choice young, and then spent 34 years too afraid to correct it, until death did what living never could, and pried the truth loose on its own schedule. What I carry now isn't anger. It's a kind of stubborn gratitude for Aunt Sarah, who kept a promise across 3 decades of silence and finally found the courage to keep it out loud. For Elijah Cole, who left a door unlocked for 34 years on the chance that someone would eventually walk through it. And strangely, even for my mother, whose fear taught me, in the end, exactly what I refused to pass down to my own children someday. That love without honesty isn't protection. It's just a longer, gentler-looking kind of loss. My aunt's last breath wasn't a goodbye. It was a door swinging open, 34 years overdue. I walked through it. I'm still walking through it. And every spring, under a pecan tree a man I never met planted the year he lost his own mother, I sit for a while and let myself simply be exactly who I turned out to be fully, finally, without anyone's permission but my own.